And so DRC is receiving very little revenue, very little GDP contribution, and very little employment in the forestry sector as it exists. There's relatively few jobs in the industrial logging sector, and the sector contributes less than 1% of the country's GDP, even though about 10% of the country's forests have been concessioned out to forestry companies. So really, the system where logs are being harvested in DRC with very little economic contribution and exported to other countries for processing is simply just a bad deal for the DRC.
And this is where I see there is a double standard as well, because it's exactly the same thing when we say about mining and oil. We have official corruptions, officials being involved in those shady deals. That does not stop the international civil society community to be vocal, to take actions, to try to do whatever they can do to stop that. But when it comes to logging, even there where you still have officials being involved, you don't see the same level of scrutiny, the same level of protest that we see when it comes to mining.
6 forestry ministers in a row basically broke the law of the DRC in assigning new forestry concessions, even though in theory those were not supposed to be assigned. What is going on within the DRC government? Are those ministers assigning these concessions simply out of a corruption-based situation? Or what does the kind of institutional gaps that are also leading to this law actually not being implemented?
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Welcome to this edition to the China in Africa podcast. And today it's not Eric Olander, but it's Géraud the Africa editor of the China Global South. And I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the managing editor of China Global South in South Africa. Cobus, good morning to you.
Good morning.
So today people will be a bit surprised not to hear Eric's voice in introduction. It's going to be our voices. And I know for many years people have been used to hear you guys talk and much more Eric talk. And they kind of they get used to that voice. So since we are a larger team, we really wanted to give people the experience to discovering the new talents and different people that are joining the team to be part of the China in Africa podcast. So I hope that you're going to enjoy hearing our voices. That's not going to be the first time. You used to hear our voice already, but not as leading conversation. Today, it's going to be us leading the conversation without Eric, and I hope that you're going to enjoy that. So it's something really interesting happened this week, and still on the way, Cobus. It's the COP16 is taking place in Cali in Colombia. It's the UN Biodiversity Summit, known as COP16, where many countries are gathering to talk about how to protect the biodiversity, what country needs to put in place as policy. And the one interesting fact about that is that China was the president from COP15 2 years ago. And when you read out different covering of this summit, we learned that China has done an extensive work into trying to get different opinions together, trying to find the middle ground for country to take concrete action to move into protecting the biodiversity. And when you see the activism that China is doing, you are kind of surprised though when you see different reporting on how Chinese companies are behaving elsewhere and how, especially when it comes to ESG standard in the mining industry or in logging activities in China or elsewhere in the global south, you're kind of surprised on how China on one hand is really trying to play the role of a leading country in protecting the biodiversity and even in climate change as well. But on the other side, we also see China being lax in certain behavior that harm the biodiversity. I don't know if you get the same feeling that I had when I was following this coverage of COP16 in Cali.
Very much so. The thing that struck me is that China wasn't just an important country there, it was leading the process. And we should say, if you're confused between why suddenly COP16 is showing up when we know that COP29 is happening next month, these are two different processes. So COP stands for Council of Parties, which is a huge annual gatherings as part of the UN framework on climate change. Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so there's two different ones. One is focused on biodiversity, which is happening at the moment. And then in November, there's the big climate one, which I think draws more attention, which focuses specifically on climate change. That's COP29. And China has been really pushing a leadership position on biodiversity specifically. It was leading the COP15, the previous one, and it set out a big framework agreement on how to arrange biodiversity. One should also keep in mind that biodiversity is about more than conservation. Conservation is important, but biodiversity is about maintaining entire ecosystems in order to then draw from them for future pharmaceuticals and other developments, for example, not just simply for tourism or other forms of conservation, important as that is.
So we see that, and you look at what China has been doing all during this conference and how the initiative it took in place. And China was even the first country to update its national biodiversity conservation strategic plan from 2023 to 2030, which kind of tells you how much China is doing and making a huge effort. When I say huge effort, I mean mostly in China, at least mostly in China, to protect its biodiversity and to really maintain its equilibrium. But when now you look at what Chinese companies are doing overseas, you have a different kind of picture. And this is what we're going to talk about today, because a few days ago, we had a conversation with the EIA, Environmental Investigation Agency, that took us in that dark space, where I say it's a kind of dark space because it's been like, 6-7 years, it's always the same stories, the same kind of reporting, where we have Chinese company involved into illegal logging, endangering species in the country, in the global south, in Central Africa region. And when you see that, you see the leading role that China is playing on one hand on international stage, but the way it's not doing that much about its own companies involved in endangering species elsewhere, it's kind of surprising to me.
Yeah, I mean, especially because biodiversity management was such a big part of this agreement that happened at the previous COP gathering. And then our conversation will show how this kind of biodiversity management is actively being undermined by, Chinese companies and their collusion with local authorities, and how there's a stark difference between Chinese forests, for example, being protected by very solid laws, and then Chinese companies stripping forests across regions like Africa at the same time. It's quite striking.
Yeah, it's really quite striking. So without further ado, I'm inviting you to listen to this conversation. We were talking to Luc Allen, member of the Environmental Investigation Agency, that produced a very interesting report on China logging in the DRC. Take a listen. So, Cobus, a few days ago, I was recording this podcast in French for the Projet Afrique Chine, and I was talking about this situation that I was a bit venting or ranting in a certain way by the fact that every year, every now and then, we have this situation of those kind of issues that somehow remain unsolvable, or where there's no much of action taken by different decision makers when those situations happen. Among those topics, we have the illegal fishing that still keep on happening on different coasts of Africa, in Indian coast and Atlantic Ocean coast, same thing happening. And this one is about illegal logging in DRC again. I mean, we've covered it in Equatorial Guinea. In Mozambique, we also have the same thing in DRC happening again. And I was just telling myself, it's kind of depressing. Every now and then, we've been covering those kind of topics for like 3 years, and we always have those issues still coming, all those reports always coming up as if nothing is changing. I don't know if you get the same feeling.
Yes, I definitely get that feeling. And the way that report after report points out the combination of Chinese companies sometimes being bad actors and at the same time being enabled by officials within the system in various African countries, kind of, keeping that cycle going, it can be quite depressing to read the 10th report saying the same thing,
Exactly. You just get the feeling that all the recommendation out there, all the work that those NGOs are doing, the journalists are doing on the ground, as if there's really not hitting the right place, the right moment where people are saying can we stand up and try to do something, either being local government, Chinese companies or anything, or the international civil society communities. They're just keep dead silent and not talking about those kind of issues. So I'm going to stop venting, but we're going to talk about again one of those topics. And there is this report of Environmental Investigation Agency that we kind of accustomed to receive them here. And the simple fact that we are accustomed to receive them on the podcast means guys, it's telling. So they've released a new report recently talking about illegal logging in the eastern part of in DRC, not in the eastern part of the DRC. And the report is entitled Until the Last Log, How a Log Export Ban Can Strengthen the DRC Economy, Stop Corporate Delinquent, and Address the Climate Crisis. This was released in October, and it's really covering the situation in the DRC and different players there, and how we see Chinese companies taking advantage, as you mentioned, of the bad governance locally, corrupted leaders, and local officials that really just take advantage of the environment just to make a quick buck.
You know, what was interesting for me in reading the report was that, on the one hand, as you were saying, it points out this kind of long-term problems. But on the other hand, it also showed some progress. For example, it was very interesting to see how the DRC is actually now an outlier among Congo Basin countries in, you know, kind of in allowing this actually. So there has been some progress. And I think it was also kind of great in terms of suggesting very concrete solutions, particularly kind of pointing out that some of these solutions are already on the books, you know, in the DRC. So in that sense, it was very interesting for me to read.
So we're going to dive straight into the report, and we're going to have Luc Allen from the Environmental Investigation Agency to join us for this conversation to tell us a bit more about the reports. Luc, good morning to you from Seattle in US.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it was nice having you when we recorded this podcast in French. Now we say, let's share the same knowledge that we had shared in French for our audience in English. So how are you doing, Luc?
Doing very well. Thank you. How are you?
I'm doing fine as well. So let's dive straight into the reports. So until the last log, as you've heard us when you were talking, my feeling about being a bit sad about all the situation, and Cobus showing that there is a certain sense of progress that's happening on the ground, where we saw DRC now standing as an outliers among Congo Basin countries, where, you know, mechanisms have been put in place, effort have been put in place by different countries to really try as much as possible to tackle the issue. So in this report, until the last log, what can you tell us about what we're going to find inside?
Well, I'll start with the part that is perhaps contributing to your feelings of depression or dejection. So the industrial logging sector in DRC, the report is an investigation into the two largest industrial logging companies operating in DRC by the area of their concessions, which are Peng and Booming Green. Peng, better known in DRC by the names of its subsidiaries, Congo King, Baisheng Forestry Development, and Congo Sunflower. Just to give you a sense of the scale of these companies, they're operating about 3 million hectares worth of forestry concessions in DRC, according to the latest available data. That's an area greater than the size of Belgium. So we're talking about companies that are operating just vast forestry concessions in the country. And at the same time, companies that in previous reporting and even an audit by the government of DRC in 2024 had been accused of illegalities and corruption in their operations. And so we as EIA wanted to get a sense of how do these companies operate, what is really their model. And so EIA investigators spoke with employees of these two companies, managers, directors, technicians of these companies to try to get a sense from them of how they're operating. And what they found was that these companies are essentially engaging in alleged illegality and corruption in order to facilitate exports of logs really as quickly and efficiently as possible without regard for environmental or social considerations. So what does this illegality look like? It looks like the misdeclaration of species. So allowing companies to export more of particular species and exploit more of particular species than what's allowed in their management plans. It looks like the disregard of their assiette annuelle de coupe, which is a technical document that's supposed to govern where and how industrial logging companies are supposed to operate in a particular concession. And it seemingly also included the bribery of public officials in order to cover up these crimes. One thing we also heard from an employee of Peng was that there was even corruption in the process of obtaining their concessions in the first place. So a Peng employee explained that they apparently bribed the general. That's what they said, the general, to obtain their concessions in DRC. The general is seemingly a reference to General Gabriel Kumba, who's been sanctioned by the Treasury Department of the United States and by the European Union for human rights abuses. So we're talking about two companies that are seemingly really disregarding forestry laws, the law of the DRC more generally, in order to export logs as efficiently as possible.
So, just to get everyone on the same page, on a very basic level, could you explain to us why is exporting logs, as they are, a worse option for a country like the DRC than exporting sawn wood in plank form?
I think there's two issues here. The first issue is a governance issue. And it's not inherently, I think, necessarily something to do with logs, but just the way that the supply chain for logs has been set up is something that EIA found in this report and is found in really a lot of our reporting across the Congo Basin, is that the worst actors in the industrial logging sector tend to depend on the export of unprocessed logs in their vast majority to China. And there, those logs enter the Chinese wood processing sector, which is really a sort of notoriously opaque, non-transparent sector. And from there, it's really impossible to know where processed wood is being sourced from. So I think that one issue is a governance issue, just that the worst actors seemingly depend on log exports. And that's something that we heard from these companies, was that their clients prefer logs, and it makes it easier for them to operate in DRC if they can just export these logs for processing elsewhere. The second issue is an economic issue, that the added value of processing the wood is being captured elsewhere. And so DRC is receiving very little revenue, very little GDP contribution, and very little employment in the forestry sector as it exists. There's relatively few jobs in the industrial logging sector, and the sector contributes less than 1% of the country's GDP, even though about 10% of the country's forests have been concessioned out to forestry companies. So really, the system where logs are being harvested in DRC with very little economic contribution and exported to other countries for processing is simply just a bad deal for the DRC.
So in the report, we see how DRC is standing as an outlier compared to other countries in the region. What DRC is doing differently than other countries to the point where those companies are now finding safe haven in the DRC to do those kind of operation?
One of the key policy differences between DRC and the other countries of the Congo Basin is that other countries in the Congo Basin are increasingly implementing log export bans, which are policies whereby a country basically bans the export of logs and maintains that all timber that is going to be exported has to be processed at some level of transformation, usually a sort of second level of transformation. This was a policy that was initially implemented in Gabon in 2011. And has been implemented really effectively in Gabon, I should add, where really, if you look back 15 years at trade data from Gabon, you see that there was essentially only exports of logs and no exports of processed wood. If you go back forward to the present day, you have a situation that's completely reversed, where Gabon is really only exporting processed wood and is not exporting any logs. You see the beginning of a similar process in other countries in the region, most notably the Republic of Congo, but also Cameroon to some extent, where there's a process of industrialization of the wood processing sector, which is also being encouraged by either complete log export bans in the case of the Republic of Congo, or partial and progressively implemented log export bans in the case of some of the other countries in the region. And this is actually something that the employees of Peng and Blooming Green referred to as an issue in their operations in the region. They said basically that they preferred to operate in DRC because they see it as simpler because there's no regulation on the export of logs in DRC. That's actually sort of technically not true for reasons I can go into in a minute, but that's at least their perception of the policy environment, is that there's no sort of regulation of log exports.
Can you go in details a bit on that part? Because somehow we had a feeling that there was that legislation in place in the DRC, but when we read the reports, the employees are telling you there's no regulation, but still in the report, we know that you mentioned the fact there is regulation in place, but somehow it's not implemented. And companies are just perceiving that, there's no regulation. How do we get to that?
It's an excellent question, and the issue sort of stems from the fact that in the 2002 Forest Code of the DRC, there is this Article 109 that is, in fact, a log export ban of sorts, and it says that all wood is to be processed before being exported, and then it also provides this sort of 10-year grace period for companies that are in the beginning of their operations where they can export 30% of their production in the form of logs. But even theoretically, you should still see 70% of their production being processed, being sawn in some form during that 10-year grace period, and then it should be 100% processed. So the spirit and the letter of that law are pretty clear. The complicating factor is that the government of DRC has not issued any implementing regulations since the 2002 Forest Code that would really make it clear how that law is going to be implemented. So there's no organ of the civil service that is responsible for implementing that law. And so these companies seemingly feel free to export all of their production in the form of logs, despite what the law says. And in fact, if you look at trade data, for instance, Chinese imports of DRC logs by volume, about 97% of production was implemented in the form of logs. So they're not coming particularly close to processing 70% or even a fraction of 70% really of their production.
So the report makes a very interesting point that, according to audits of forestry concessions granted, 6 forestry ministers in a row basically broke the law of the DRC in assigning new forestry concessions, even though in theory those were not supposed to be assigned. So you mentioned that there is this kind of lack of capability or lack of kind of institutional gap basically to try and, but which holds back the implementation of the law. Could you talk a little bit more about what is going on within the DRC government? Are those ministers assigning these concessions simply out of a corruption-based situation, or what are the kind of institutional gaps that are also leading to this law actually not being implemented?
I think there's at least 2 issues here, one of which is the opacity of the sector. So in our research on it, it took a lot of digging and a lot of time to really get a sense of just at a very basic level who the players are, which players are still active, which concessions are still operating, because the information that's available about this is not particularly transparent. And so that creates an issue from the perspective also of civil society in DRC, who then have a much more difficult job on their hands in terms of regulating and sort of being the watchdog for the sector, of monitoring the sector and the government's sort of ability to govern the sector. It does seem that there were also, as you referenced with the 2002 moratorium, successive governments that violated this moratorium. So the moratorium was a policy instituted in 2002, which said, basically, given the governance concerns around the industrial logging sector in DRC, we're going to kind of freeze the sector as it is right now. So there's already 80 or 100 concessions out there, but we're not going to allocate any more concessions until we've kind of cleaned up the sector. And that policy is actually still in place to this day, despite some rumors going around that the government is considering lifting that policy. I think the process by which concessions were reallocated, I think the example of Peng obtaining their concession by paying a bribe to General Gabriel Kumba seemingly is indicative of a sort of lack of oversight and governance of the sector, and one which I think is harmful to DRC's ability to be a climate and biodiversity solution country, which is increasingly how the government is positioning itself internationally, because the forests of the Congo Basin are obviously this incredibly rich and important resource in terms of the climate and biodiversity crises. And I think having this industrial logging sector that's sort of engaging in this seeming laissez-faire is undermining their ability to play that role.
In your reports and different reports that we've read before on the same topic, the name of the General Gabriel Kumba Misi comes so often. For those who don't know, let me give a bit of a context. General Gabriel Amisi Kumba is general in DRC Armed Forces. He's a very powerful man to a certain extent, and is now in charge of a certain portion of the army, unit of the army in the capital city in Kinshasa. He's not as powerful he used to be under President Kabila, but he still remains powerful. He's from the eastern part of the DRC. But when you look where the logging is happening in the center part of the DRC, also some part in the west part of the DRC. So he's kind of one of the players that always come into when we talk about illegal logging in DRC. So I wanted to know, Luke, if in your investigation you were able to determine how that personage became basically to every illegal logging in the DRC.
It's a great question, and I think one of the things that's notable about the geography of industrial logging in the DRC is the extent to which it is clustered around rivers. And the Congo River is the most sort of efficient vector of transportation back to ports or it can be exported internationally. So it's very much concentrated in the sort of central and western parts of the country as opposed to the eastern part of the country. In terms of General Gabriel Misikumba's ability to insert himself into that sector, I don't actually have a good answer to that off the top of my head. It's something that we found in our reporting was his relationship to that sector, but not necessarily the how of how that happened.
You know, in some of the other reports, they've also pointed out, as you've also pointed out now, that there's very high levels of opacity on the Chinese side. Like once the logs arrive in China, it's very difficult to track where they come from and whether they're legally or not. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that aspect of the Chinese timber industry. Like, why is it so opaque? Why isn't there better oversight? And is there any kind of way, technological or otherwise, any kind of way of making logs more traceable?
There are ways of making logs more traceable. So, for instance, EIA is piloting a project in Gabon, a timber traceability project, which is supposed to provide this unbroken chain of custody, basically from the stump to the end point of consumption. Now, as I mentioned, Gabon has a log export ban, which in some sense makes it easier to trace that timber to its end point because it's not going through this very opaque Chinese wood processing industry. But I think that gets to one of the sort of hidden advantages perhaps of a log export ban is it does in some sense make the traceability of wood and the ability to verify the legality of wood a little bit easier and makes it easier for instance, civil society groups to monitor the data that's coming into a system like that to see whether the wood is legal and sort of ground truth that data in real time. In terms of the Chinese wood processing sector, it's an issue that's come up in many of the reports that we've written about the Congo Basin, where it's really become the dominant importing market for Congo Basin timber over the last 10 to 15 years. And indeed, Congo Basin logs, almost the exclusive importing market. It is not a particularly transparent sector as it exists now. And I think one of the issues is that essentially the wood will come from DRC or Republic of Congo or Cameroon or wherever, and it'll be sold by a trader and then eventually just disappear into the sort of black box of the wood processing sector. And in the report that we wrote on Equatorial Guinea, it took us the better part of 5 to 6 years to really untease where the wood that was coming from Equatorial Guinea was coming out in that supply chain. It's really not straightforward to unpack that. I think from the perspective of the government of China, I think there's a couple of potential answers here, one of which would be to clarify the application of the forestry law, and particularly Article 65 of China's forestry law to imported timber. So Article 65 of the forestry law indicates that it's illegal to transport or purchase or process wood that's illegally sourced. That has been, I think, pretty rigorously applied, as I understand it, to domestically sourced timber, but not necessarily to internationally sourced imported timber that might be illegally sourced. And so I think one shift that could potentially encourage a change in governance by the exporting countries would be to clarify that that wood is now illegal to purchase and process in China. I think a second shift that could be helpful is just greater cooperation between the government of China and governments of the region to address these sorts of initiatives, basically through bilateral collaboration.
You know, something that's quite interesting, Cobus. I was reading different communique coming out of FOCAC, and it was really interesting to see that there's almost no mention of those kind of illegal logging issues in those communique or initiatives. There's a broad sentence saying that, working together to protect biodiversity, but there's really no element where African countries put that on the table by saying that we need to address that. Last year, Congo Basin countries, they gathered together in Brazzaville, complained about the role that Chinese companies were playing in the illegal logging in that region. You'd expect after seeing something like that during this FOCAC, they're going to bring that on the table. But they did not. This is something that really baffled me.
It clearly shows also a lack of political will. I think we see similar kind of dynamics around illegal fishing as well. And one of the things that Luke and his colleagues has pointed out in earlier reports has also been the difficulty of frequently when these abuses are raised on the Chinese side, the standard response is, we need an official complaint from a government like the DRC's government. And of course, because there's so little political will and because some of the officials are complicit in it, that doesn't move forward. Where there is an interesting contrast is in the earlier campaign in Africa to crack down on the poaching of elephants for the ivory trade, which was also very largely going to China. And that political will actually translated into getting China to ban like ivory markets and also domestic ivory carving, which was an entire artisanal sector, in the Chinese economy. So that was very successful. So expanding on that, Luke, I wanted to ask you, at the last COP meeting last year, the DRC was, as if I remember correctly, was one of the countries, like forest cover countries, that was kind of meeting on the sidelines of COP with countries like Brazil, for example. And I assume that that's also was feeding into this being this kind of solution state, as you were pointing out also. So I was wondering what are some of, like, whether you see such kind of organization happening at the upcoming COP that's happening next month, I think, but then also what is in it for countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo to be known as a solution country, and what kind of other thinking about the forest assets is coming up compared to just simply logging them for short-term gain? Is there kind of a paradigm thinking starting to come up?
Look, allow me to add something else. When we look into the recommendation, we see a recommendation given to Congolese government, to Chinese, and to also different actors. But it reminds me also of the story about Equatorial Guinea, or even Mozambique, and talking about what Cobus said in terms of initiative. Are we seeing any kind of global civil society initiative in place to track those kind of issues, to really make sure that, we don't have the illegal logging also spreading out around the world? Do we see something similar, just like do we see in the mining industry? Do we see something similar with the logging industry?
I think there are initiatives in the industrial logging industry to tackle this issue of illegal logging. My sense also is that these initiatives are somewhat uneven geographically. And so, for instance, I think work on the traceability and transparency of logs that are being exported or processed timber that is being exported is really paramount in that context, in order to be able to actually know whether wood is being sort of illegally sourced or not, because otherwise you're kind of playing whack-a-mole with this problem where you might have a particular species or a particular geography that is problematic, but short of sort of systemic solutions, you may not be addressing the kind of fundamental drivers. I think in terms of the question of what's in it for DRC, my sense is that the government of DRC is taking a look at the reality of the forest sector as it exists, which is contributing, as I mentioned, less than 1% of the country's GDP, despite being 10% of the forest lands being concessioned out, and feeling that that is not the deal that they want, and feeling that that is an unfair exchange in some sense. So I think is looking at the international sort of financing landscape and seeing greater opportunities as a solution country in these sort of biodiversity, and particularly in the climate space. Last year, the DRC received, I think, $63 million from international donors related to its role in the new green economy and to invest in the new green economy. And I think it'll be interesting to follow investments like that and to see what is going to happen with them, and really whether they're going to tangibly lead to shifts in the governance environment in the country, because I think those are potentially productive investments, but I think the devil is always in the details in terms of actually how that money is going to be used.
Until the last log, how a log export ban can strengthen DRC's economy, stop corporate delinquent, and address the climate crisis. This is the last report by the EIA, Environmental Investigation Agency, covering practices of illegal logging that's happening in DRC, where we see two big Chinese companies being involved in that traffic. It was a pleasure to have you, Luke, to really take us into that report, and I hope that our audience can learn something new and kind of hope take action to a certain extent. We did that, we've covered that when it was about how Equatorial Guinea logs find themselves in the big stores in the US. I hope since then they took actions and those logs have been cleared out and they've been now more clean than what we see now. But yes, this is the report of Environmental Investigation Agency. We're going to put the link and the information in the show notes. You're going to have access to the reports. Luke, it was a pleasure to have you in this podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Cobus, when we've heard that conversation with Luke, when you hear everything that I said, I remember when I was talking with him, when I was recording the same podcast with him for the French, I was really sharing with him my frustration regarding the international civil society community, how they are not as vocal about those activities compared to when it comes to illegal mining, to artisanal mining and everything. And I don't know if you have the same feeling where we kind of pick and choose where our anger, our frustration needs to be directed, as if we don't really pay attention to everything that's where I think everything that's really going bad, or because, I don't know, I'm just venting, but I really get that feeling there is a kind of double standard, or is the fact that because logging and timbers are not as strategic as copper, cobalt or coltan, that's why maybe we don't need to talk about as much as we should be talking about.
Yeah, I really share that frustration. We are told that critical minerals, for example, is this existential issue that everyone has to kind of get involved in or has to pay attention to. But at the same time, the massive damage to ecosystems and the kind of implications that that has for the future of human life is largely ignored, or it's kind of held in a silo. So I think also that it's really important to connect these discussions to larger political discussions. You know, it's just as important for these countries to preserve forests and for us to talk about the politics of preserving forests, for example, as it is to talk about critical minerals. You know, it has the same level of kind of existential importance to human survival, I think. And they really have to be discussed together, I think.
Exactly, especially when you're talking about country like the DRC or other country in Central African region, because the Congo Basin forests represent what we call the second lung of the humanity. And when you see the amount of illegal activity that's happening there, you cannot be talking about climate change, energy transition, at the same time not taking action and being much more vocal when it comes about protecting what we see to be the second lung of humanity, the second lung of the planet. So this is where you see the kind of disconnect in terms of priority, and you kind of wonder, is it because one has much more geopolitical importance and national security angle to it, and the other seems to be a very low-hanging fruit in terms of quote-unquote priority? But when you put them at the scale of climate change and humanity survival, they all should be addressed and approached at the same level of intensity and scrutiny. But you don't see that often.
And I think African governments need to take some of the blame for this, actually. Not only in how they are actively colluding with some of these companies to maintain these kind of bad practices, but also because they are not really being vocal about these problems. If we compare it to, for example, the kind of expression of protest that happened around ivory trade, you know, from African governments at spaces like FOCAC in the 2010s, that actually had real impact. They need to be doing the same thing about forests. But of course, some officials are directly making money out of this, so that's why the silence is.
But it's also the same thing when it comes to mining. And this is where I see there is a double standard as well, because it's exactly the same thing when we say about mining and oil. We have corruptions, we have official corruptions, official being involved in those shady deals. That does not stop the international civil society community to be vocal, to take actions, to try to do whatever they can do to stop that. But when it comes to logging, even there where you still have official being involved, you don't see the same level of scrutiny, the same level of protest that we see when it comes to mining. And when I was preparing the podcast with Luke, I was asking him, maybe it's because we don't see child labor in those logging activities that people are not talking about. They don't really talk about that. And the reality is, given how intensive the logging activities are, it's unlikely to find child labor being involved in that. I think because you don't have that maybe humanitarian angle to those scandals, you don't see the same level of outrage that you would have seen because artisanal mining, seeing child walking around. And I think it's more sexy to talk about, to say, you know, there is blood in your phone than to say there is blood on your chair.
Yeah, I think so. I think people still have a kind of a disconnect in their minds that the wooden furniture they buy in a place like IKEA grew somewhere, actually, and frequently were not in some kind of plan planned, managed plantation, but actually an old-growth forest. I think that disconnect is still not clear for people, and I think this is why the EIA's work is so great, because they have, over time, have built up a whole kind of archive of different kind of perspectives on this issue. So you can really see it in terms of the DRC, in terms of the Republic of Congo, in terms of Gabon and, Equatorial Guinea, all of these different countries, and how both the same dynamics are showing up, but then also some countries actually doing better at curbing these problems than others.
Yes, exactly. And Luke was even telling us that according to the last report they did about Equatorial Guinea, where the wood was finding itself in Home Depot in the US, since then Home Depot has taken the commitment to remove all its furniture that was built with those woods coming from Equatorial Guinea. So, until the last log, how a long export ban can strengthen DRC's economy, stop corporate delinquent, and address the climate crisis. This is the report that was published by Environmental Investigation Agency, and we're going to put all the information in the show notes so you can download the reports. And if you're going on our website, on the podcast, you're going to see a series of podcasts we've done with the EIA, and you're going to see all the stories that we've covered in being in Mozambique, in Equatorial Guinea, being in the DRC, other stories that we also covered in Cameroon or Nigeria. You're going to see all those stories related to illegal logging where Chinese companies have been involved in. And as Cobus said, most of the time, officials, they are not as vocal they want to be when it comes to that, because they're also benefiting from those illegal logging. So that was Christian Géraud and Cobus van Staden. It was a pleasure to have you in this episode of China in Africa podcast. See you next week.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.